Hello and welcome to the race data analysis for the Turkish Grand Prix, the slightly bizarre Turkish Grand Prix where it was wet and didn't really dry at all. This is the series in which we'll be compiling all of the data that I can grab my hands on for the Turkish Grand Prix. We'll be pitting the teammates against each other to see exactly where each one was outperforming the other. Everything is all timestamped in the description down below, so please feel free to skip to whichever segment of the video you would like me to talk about. So without further ado, let us jump on into the race overview and we'll take a look first at the positions chart. And honestly, I think this is the most boring positions chart that we have seen all season long. Mainly because there is literally no pit stops whatsoever. We saw Sebastian Vettel lose quite a lot of positions from P10 all the way down to the back of the grid when he gambled falsely on the medium compound of tyre, and then he only ended up finishing P18. We can also see Lewis Hamilton charging his way through the field, getting past Tsunoda, Stroll and also Norris in consecutive laps, and then that's pretty much it. So from the positions table, we'll take a look at the overall lap chart, which again doesn't really show us a great deal of anything. There isn't really too much lap time progression, which is what we would expect to see. There would be a nice negative gradient in lap time as the fuel burns off and the cars get quicker and quicker. That just doesn't really happen in this Grand Prix. But zooming in on that main section of racing, excluding all of the couple of pit stops that we had, we can see a couple of bands of racing, but really not too much. We can see the two Haas cars, which are the pastel green and the pastel blue colours at the top of Mick Schumacher and Nikita Mazepin. There's then a sort of middle group of cars, and then there are the front runners, which is a mix of the two Mercedes, the two Red Bulls, also the McLaren and the Ferrari as well. But then by the midpoint of the race, we essentially just have two bands. We have everybody, and then we have the two Haas cars, which at this point were being lapped, which is why they are considerably slower, around 3 seconds a lap slower compared to their usual 1 second per lap slower. And then by the time we get post-second pit stop, it's just a mass of spaghetti. There really isn't any discernible groups and discernible pace groups in this Grand Prix. So normally in a dry race, we would expect there to be at least 3 bands of racing, where you've got the top runners, you then have the midfield, and then you have the backpack as well. Sometimes it splits into 4 when there is a definitive pace difference between the midfield, and very, very rarely have we seen it split into 5 individual groups. It usually happens at the start. In the first stint, that is where the big pace difference comes from the top teams, and then it just sort of morphs into less and less and less as we go through the race. But then if we just take a look at the gap to the race leader, which was predominantly Valtteri Bottas and occasionally Charles Leclerc, we can see once again the two Haas cars were fairly on pace just a little bit for the first 10 or so laps, but then that was when they really started to drop off, and especially from lap 40 onwards, they were losing 2 to 3 seconds per lap at the end of the Grand Prix. And again, this graph, we really can't see too much detail at all because there weren't really any pit stop strategies whatsoever. Pit stops in this race just didn't really exist. Now, this is where the video is going to slightly take a small little tangent from the norm, as normally I would take a look at the clean air lap pace and take a look at who was fastest and what team was fastest, then take a look at the whole season's progression and which team is the fastest so far. However, as it was a rainy race, I will not be including it, and I can't really look too much into clean air laps during a rainy race. So what I'll do instead is we're going to take a detailed breakdown of should Lewis Hamilton have pitted or not pitted. So on screen now is the gap to the race leader, but only a select few drivers. Esteban Ocon, who did manage to run the entire race on 1 set of intermediate compound of tyre, Charles Leclerc, Lewis Hamilton, and also Max Verstappen as just a reference. However, this includes some detail that we are not really interested in, essentially the first 30 or so laps. So let us exclude that and start from lap 30 all the way to the end at laps 58. So let's start to break this down. We have a small little decrease for each of the 4 drivers in question here. This is when Valtteri Bottas came in and Charles Leclerc became the de facto race leader. So we can basically ignore this sharp decrease in gap. This one over here is where Charles Leclerc then came in for his pit stop after he was passed by Valtteri Bottas. Then this around lap 50 to 51 was when Lewis Hamilton came in for his pit stop overall. But what we are most interested in this analysis is Esteban Ocon's lap times from lap 46 onwards until the end, where his tyres started to degrade. We can see that from laps 38 to 44 he is on a nice consistent gap to the race leader of just around 60 seconds. However, at lap 45 this starts to very slowly exponentially increase from laps 45 at 60 seconds to lap 58 where it was 100 seconds. So over the course of 15 laps, his gap was extended by 40 seconds. And what we can see a couple of laps after this is the same happening to Charles Leclerc. The moment he was passed by Valtteri Bottas, his lap times start to decrease. And then again, we can see exactly the same with Lewis Hamilton, his lap times ever so slightly starting to decrease. Where both drivers were again exactly like Esteban Ocon, holding a consistent gap to the race leader, and then at this point around laps 48 to 49 they start to decrease. We're now going to take a look at a slightly different graph, and this is the time lost to the leader each lap. So we've got the two pit stops for Charles Leclerc and also Lewis Hamilton, where they lost 20 seconds for Leclerc and 16 seconds for Lewis Hamilton. And at the point where Esteban Ocon's tyres were degrading the most, these 4 laps here, he was losing anywhere between 4 and 6 seconds per lap to the race leader. And we can see that just before his tyres started to degrade, that Lewis Hamilton and also Charles Leclerc were on an identical trend to Esteban Ocon. Now, there is absolutely no doubt in my mind that Lewis Hamilton would have followed this exact trend. All of the signs are there. He was going to be losing 4 to 5 seconds per lap if he would have stayed out. And bear in mind, he only had a 11 or 12 second gap to Charles Leclerc and Sergio Perez, who had pitted before him. And he just wouldn't have had the pace to defend. Yes, he absolutely would have defended with all of his might, but the pace difference between the two cars would have been monumental for his old tyres compared to their new tyres. And at that point, he would have fallen down to P5 anyway, being passed by both Leclerc and Perez, and then he would have been at threat by the McLaren of Lando Norris as well, and equally people behind him like Gasly, etc. If he really is losing that amount of time per lap, exactly like Esteban Ocon was, he could have been at threat to even worse than P5 had he stayed out. But taking a look back at this lap time chart, we can see that after his pit stop, he was still losing a significant chunk of time to the race leader each lap, around 3 seconds. Now, this is the graining phase that he went through, where the new intermediate tyres began to grain and weren't talking to the racetrack. So heading back to that original graph of the gap to the race leader, we can see where Lewis Hamilton actually came in for his pit stop on lap 51. We can see that P5 was ultimately the best he could have achieved. There was no way he was going to be able to hold on to that P3 slot, losing the time that he would have done had he stayed out on those intermediate tyres. Now, it can easily be argued that his defensive driving would have been enough to hold on to P3, but personally, with a pace deficit of around 4 seconds per lap, no one can defend from that. You've got no traction coming out of all of the key traction zones. You've got no cornering or apex speed. He would not have been able to hold on to that P3 slot all the way to the end. Yes, he could have driven to the end exactly the same way as Esteban Ocon did, but he would not have been able to hold on to that P3. And at ultimate worst, he could have been in the wall, or his tyre could have delaminated and he could have had 0 points. So pitting was by far and away the most sensible option for Mercedes. Now, by all means, feel free to completely disagree / agree or support with your own data in the comments down below what you think whether Hamilton should have come in or stayed out. But what we're going to do now is we're going to take a look at the teammate breakdowns. Like I said, everything is timestamped in the description down below, so please feel free to skip to whichever team you would like me to talk about. We are going in 2020 Constructors' Championship order, so we start with Mercedes and we'll end with Williams. Now, on screen now is the Mercedes panel between Valtteri Bottas in the turquoise and Lewis Hamilton in the black. Now, normally with the lap chart, I would put on the previous pace at the same track last year. However, as the tracks were completely different and this year was rainy, I haven't opted to put that on as the difference wouldn't even be comparable. Now directly below the Mercedes lap charts we have the Mercedes gaps per lap. Again, Valtteri Bottas in the turquoise and Lewis Hamilton in the black. We've got the positions chart in the top right, and then we have their percentage pace difference in the bottom right. And this percentage pace difference takes all of Lewis Hamilton's lap times and divides them all by Valtteri Bottas's lap times, converts those to a percentage, then any percentage above 100% is when Lewis Hamilton is going faster, then anything below 100 is when Valtteri Bottas is going faster. These percentages are then ordered from largest down to smallest, and then we end up with this nice distribution that is seen on screen. We can then split this percentage pace difference down the middle, and we can see that for 69% exactly for the race duration, it was Valtteri Bottas who was the faster of the two cars, and therefore for 31% it was Lewis Hamilton. But turning our attention to the lap charts, we can see a large 2-second per lap difference between Bottas and Hamilton, which extends the gap in Bottas's favour to around 20 seconds. This is mainly Hamilton having to fight his way through the field, as after he gets to a solid P5 running, he's literally setting identical lap times to Valtteri Bottas, and the gap stays between 20 and 15 seconds for around 30 or so laps. And this gap holds right up until the pit stop phase, and then after Lewis Hamilton's pit stop, we can see here that he goes through that graining phase where again he loses around 1 to 2 seconds per lap to Valtteri Bottas until the checkered flag. Now again, normally I would then break down their clean air lap pace from 2020 to present day and then between the two drivers, but as I have not done the clean air lap analysis because it was a rainy race, we will now move on to Red Bull. So on screen is the Red Bull chart. We've got Sergio Perez in the dark blue and Max Verstappen in the light blue. And splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 32.8% it was Sergio Perez who was the faster of the two cars, and therefore for 67.2% it was Max Verstappen. And looking at their overall lap charts, they were setting fairly similar lap times, but Max Verstappen around half a second, maybe 0.3 a lap faster than Sergio Perez pretty much consistently up until around lap 20. Then both drivers come in for their pit stops at pretty much the same time, where there is this small decrease in the gap as Verstappen came in first, so Perez closes the gap by about 20 seconds and then it immediately goes back up to 20 as Perez comes in. Then post pit stop, they're once again setting pretty much identical lap times and the gap stays at 20 seconds until the checkered flag. Then from Red Bull we'll take a look at McLaren, where Daniel Ricciardo is in the blue and Lando Norris is in the orange, and splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle for just 14% of this entire race distance, it was Daniel Ricciardo who was the faster of the two cars, and for 86% it was Lando Norris. This is one of the largest teammate splits that we have had this season. We have seen a 92-8 split, and that was from Max Verstappen and Sergio Perez, but 86 and 14 is hefty. And we can see that in the opening stint, for the first almost 25 laps, Lando Norris was the faster of the McLaren cars for 100% of those laps, where he extends the gap to almost half a minute by lap 20. Ricciardo then comes in for his pit stop, and then he is only just able to match Lando Norris's lap times, where the gap stays at 50 seconds. He's not able to take advantage of his new intermediate compound of tyre as they end up going through that graining phase. However, when Lando Norris comes in for his pit stop, that is when Ricciardo does have a small pace advantage, as it is then Lando Norris's turn to get into the graining phase. However, an enormous gulf opens up between the two cars as Lando Norris manages to find the sweet spot and speeds up to lap times of 1 minute 33, 93 seconds, whereas Daniel Ricciardo ends up slowing down at the end of the Grand Prix, and his lap times extend all the way up to almost 1 minute and 40. So the gap exponentially increases from 30 seconds to 70 seconds in just 10 laps. So from McLaren, we'll now take a look at Aston Martin, where Lance Stroll is in the pink and Sebastian Vettel is in the green. Splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle, for 70.2% it was Lance Stroll who was the faster of the two cars, and therefore for 29.8% it was Sebastian Vettel. Lance Stroll, it is fair to say, wiped the floor with Sebastian Vettel this Grand Prix. Even before Vettel's poor call to go onto the medium tyres happened, he was dominating the German. But we can see in the opening couple of laps they were pretty much even. Lance Stroll was perhaps 1 or 2 tenths a lap faster than Sebastian Vettel. However, after lap 12, this gap opens up to almost 8 tenths to almost a second at times per lap for around 20 laps, extending the gap to 20 seconds. We then have Sebastian Vettel's extremely poor call to go onto the medium compound of tyre, where he spins a couple of times and then comes back into the pits, where the gap extends to almost 2 minutes between the two drivers. However, in the second half of the race, after Lance Stroll's pit stop, it is Sebastian Vettel who sets the fastest lap times of the Aston Martins by around, again, half a second or so, bringing the gap down from 80 seconds to almost 60 at the checkered flag. Then from Aston Martin, we'll take a look at Alpine, where Esteban Ocon is in the white and Fernando Alonso is in the dark blue. Splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 61.4%, it was Esteban Ocon who was the faster of the two cars, and for 38.6%, it was Fernando Alonso. Now, considering Alonso's extremely high starting position and then his spin at the opening portion of the race, I was kind of expecting him to fight back against Esteban Ocon. However, that didn't really happen at all. In that opening stint, it was Esteban Ocon who was consistently the faster of the two cars, only by around 3 to 4 tenths per lap, but enough to extend the gap to 20 seconds before the first pit stop from Fernando Alonso at lap 30. So Alonso then comes in for his pit stop at lap 30, which extends the gap to almost 50 seconds. He then has a period of inconsistent lap times where Esteban Ocon is able to set more consistent lap times, extending the gap to just over 50 seconds. However, Esteban Ocon's tyres then start to degrade and his lap times decrease exponentially, as actually Fernando Alonso's lap times increase exponentially. So we have this ridiculously sharp decrease in gap. In the last 12 laps, it decreases from 50 seconds to 20, half a minute in just 12 laps. Then from Alpine, we'll take a look at Ferrari, where Charles Leclerc is in the red and Carlos Sainz is in the black. Splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 32.8% of the race, it was Carlos Sainz who was the faster of the two Ferraris, and therefore for 67.2%, it was Charles Leclerc. Where again, in that opening stint of the race, it was Leclerc who was setting consistent 1 minute 35 lap times, as Carlos Sainz was fighting his way back from last, charging his way through the field, all the way down to P8. So the gap does extend in the Monegasque's favour to half a minute by lap 15, but there is a very, very valid reason. Once Carlos Sainz is able to set lap times in essentially clean air after he has passed all of the traffic, he's able to set very consistent lap times compared to Charles Leclerc. So both Ferrari drivers come in for pit stops 10 laps apart, where there is actually a 10 seconds time loss in Charles Leclerc's lead. So before Carlos Sainz came in for the stop, it was at 40 seconds, and then by the time Leclerc came in for his stop, the gap had come down to 30 seconds. And this is where Carlos Sainz was able to really put in some mammoth lap times and decrease that gap from 30 seconds to almost 10 at the checkered flag in the last 12 laps. Then from Ferrari, we will take a look at Alfa Tauri, where Yuki Tsunoda is in the white and Pierre Gasly is in the black. And splitting the percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 17.5% of the race, it was Yuki Tsunoda who was the faster of the two cars, and for 82.5%, it was Pierre Gasly. So much like Daniel Ricciardo, this was an extremely poor race for Yuki Tsunoda. And we can see that in the opening stint of the race, this is where Yuki Tsunoda was the closest to Pierre Gasly, with a gap of around 2 to 3 tenths per lap, extending the advantage in Gasly's favour to around 15 seconds by lap 12. Then Tsunoda had either a spin or a pit stop. I can't quite remember which order this came in, but I do believe this is a pit stop around lap 24. He then set a slew of really slow lap times compared to Pierre Gasly, and also extremely inconsistent lap times compared to Pierre Gasly, where after this pit stop around lap 21, the gap was 30 seconds, which extended all the way to 80 seconds at the checkered flag. So then from AlphaTauri, we'll take a look at Alfa Romeo, where Antonio Giovinazzi is in the white and Kimi Raikkonen is in the red. And we can split their percentage pace difference down the middle and see that for 63.2% it was Giovinazzi in the white who was the faster of the two cars, and therefore for 36.8% it was Kimi Raikkonen. where actually in the first stint of this race, both drivers were setting exceptionally similar lap times where the gap was just staying at 1 second. There was literally nothing to split between the two drivers. Right up until around lap 21, where Giovinazzi was able to put in consistent 1 minute 35 lap times, as Kimi Raikkonen starts to slightly drop off until he comes in for his pit stop a couple of laps earlier than Antonio Giovinazzi. Then right at the very end of the race, it is Kimi Raikkonen who is able to set in some extremely quick lap times to bring this gap down from 15 seconds to literally nothing once again at the checkered flag. Then penultimately we'll take a look at Haas, where Mick Schumacher is in the grey and Mazepin in the white. Splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 46.4% it was Nikita Mazepin who was the faster of the two cars, and therefore for 53.6% it was Mick Schumacher. And this is a fairly consistent trend that we have seen, where they've more often than not been closer than people think. And in that first stint, they were literally dead even, exactly the same as the two Alfa Romeos. A small little fluctuation, but they were pretty much setting the same lap times. Both drivers then start to get lapped at again the same period of time, where they set extremely inconsistent lap times as they have to get out of the way of the blue flag traffic. And this lasts all the way up until their pit stop phase at around lap 40, where it is Mick Schumacher who manages to get past in the only teammate positional swap of this entire race. And then finally we will take a look at Williams, where Nicholas Latifi is in the blue and George Russell is in the white. We can split their percentage pace difference down the middle and see that for 52.6% of the race it was Latifi who was the faster of the two cars, and for 47.4% it was George Russell. And again, this is an extremely common trend that we've seen so far this season, where Latifi actually has better race pace than George Russell. Admittedly, this wasn't one of Russell's stronger races and was probably one of Latifi's stronger races overall, but it's still very common to see Latifi actually outperform Russell in terms of race pace, where there is a very distinct difference between race result and race pace. I just want to end up clearing that up before people start commenting that I think that Latifi is a better driver than Russell, because I don't. It's just Latifi sometimes has better race pace than George Russell. And we can see that in that opening stint, like the Alfa Romeos and the Haases before them, they are dead even. Maybe George Russell is around a tenth or two faster than Nicholas Latifi, but there really isn't much in it. And then again, before their pit stops, they're dead even. The gap is staying at 10 seconds for 30 laps of this Grand Prix. Both drivers then come in for their pit stops around lap 36, where it is actually Latifi who takes full advantage of the fresher tyres, as George Russell struggles a lot more than Nicholas Latifi, and that is where the gap decreases and the pace differential between the two really sets in. And there we go, there is all of the race data concluded for the Turkish Grand Prix. Please let me know of anything that you thought interesting about this video in the comments down below. Do you think that Lewis Hamilton should have pitted or should have stayed out and tried to defend his P3 slot? And then what did you find most interesting about the teammate comparison as well? But that is all I've got for you today, guys. I hope you have enjoyed, and I will catch you in the next episode with whatever and whenever I decide to make it. I'll see you guys then.